You spent 40 years pouring concrete and reading blueprints, and you think that makes you somebody? My stepfather closed an 8-figure deal before lunch today. I used to be embarrassed to bring friends home. Now I'm embarrassed you're still my father. My daughter said that to me in the private dining room of a steakhouse on the 12th floor, the kind of place where the wine list has no prices because if you have to ask, you don't belong at the table. She said it standing up, her napkin falling to the floor, her finger pointed at my chest the way you'd point at something you found on the bottom of your shoe. 20 people at nearby tables turned to look at me. I watched a waiter freeze mid-pour, the bottle tilted, wine about to spill over the rim of a glass that wasn't mine. Nobody said a word in my defense. Not my daughter's husband, who smirked into his cocktail. Not my ex-wife, who studied the tablecloth like it held the answer to a question she didn't want to be asked. Not even the man sitting at the head of the table, my former father-in-law, a real estate developer named Preston Cole, who leaned back with the calm satisfaction of a man watching a horse he'd bet on cross the finish line first. And me? I sat there, still, quiet. Because in that exact moment something shifted in my chest that had nothing to do with anger. My daughter, Whitney, genuinely believed that the design firm bearing her name, the corner penthouse she called her own, the $200,000 car in her building's garage, she believed all of it was hers, earned through her own brilliance and hustle. She had no idea that every wall of that life was one I had built quietly, brick by invisible brick, for 11 years. She didn't know that with a single phone call, all of it could come apart before the following Friday. My name is Harold Whitfield. I'm 66 years old, and I spent my life as a civil engineer in Cincinnati, Ohio. The kind of work where your name never ends up on the building, but the building doesn't fall down because of you. I want to tell you exactly what happened over the next 9 days, because even now, weeks later, I'm still turning it over trying to find the moment I could have stopped it. And somewhere in this story, I want you to ask yourself, honestly, what you would have done sitting in my chair. I need to say this clearly before I go any further. I did not raise a cruel daughter. It would be easy to make her the villain of this story from the very first scene, and that would miss everything that actually happened. Whitney was raised in a house that taught her one thing was worth respecting above all else, how big your name looked on the outside. And I wasn't the one who taught her that lesson. Her mother did. A woman named Denise, who I'd built a life with for 26 years, until she left me for Preston Cole 9 years ago, a man with a tan that never faded and a laugh you could hear from the parking lot. The dinner where everything cracked open happened at a restaurant Preston had chosen, of course, because Preston always chose. It was the kind of place where the chairs were upholstered in something softer than most people's beds, and a man in a gray suit that had served him faithfully for 15 years felt, the second he walked in, like an uninvited guest at his own family's table. I wore that gray suit anyway. It was well made, and it fit exactly the way it had the day I bought it. And there is a kind of dignity in that, in wearing something built to last instead of something built to be noticed. But at that table, nothing quiet had a place. Everyone was performing. Whitney had spent the first 20 minutes of dinner narrating her own success like she was reading headlines off a teleprompter. Her design firm had just been featured in a magazine. She'd been invited to speak at a conference in Miami. Her husband, a slick young man named Colton who worked in something he called brand strategy and I had never fully understood, kept nodding along like a man agreeing with a sermon he'd heard many times and loved every time it repeated. I said very little. I ate slowly. I knew things none of them did. I knew, for instance, exactly which entity had wired the first $140,000 into Whitney's firm the year she started it, and it wasn't the small business grant she liked to mention in interviews. Denise sat across from me, in a dress that cost more than my first car, and she looked at Preston the way you look at a fireplace on a cold night, and then she looked at me the way you look at a fireplace that's gone out. She said, without prompting, that Whitney had always had the eye for success, that some people were simply born knowing how to build something out of nothing. She said it while looking directly at me. It wasn't a compliment to our daughter. It was a verdict on me. Then Preston did what Preston always did at these dinners. He waited until the table's attention had settled fully on him, and he delivered his little sermon. He told me, in that warm, condescending voice men like him, perfect over decades of being listened to, that I was a good, honest worker, the kind of man companies need but never celebrate, but that I had never once taken a real risk in my life. He said the world rewards builders of empires, not builders of bridges. Whitney nodded along at this too, eager the way she always was to agree with anything that put daylight between herself and me. I'd stopped being careful to them years ago. Now I was small. The words kept changing. What stayed the same was the direction they were always pointed. And then, over dessert, it happened. Whitney set down her fork like she'd finally found the courage to say what she'd apparently been rehearsing all night. She stood, her chair scraping against the marble floor, loud enough that 3 tables turned to look. She said the line about the concrete and the blueprints. She said the line about being embarrassed. And then, gesturing from Preston to me like she was comparing 2 exhibits in a museum, she said, "That's the difference between a real man and you, Dad. Preston built something. You just poured foundations for other people's dreams your whole life." The room went quiet. In that specific way, rooms go quiet when everyone is pretending not to listen. Colton smiled into his glass. Denise looked at her plate, and I looked at my daughter's face, and, for one flickering second, saw the 6-year-old who used to fall asleep on my chest during Sunday drives, who used to ask me to draw her pictures of the buildings I was working on. That flicker vanished fast, buried under the version of her that had been built, brick by 2 other people over 9 years. The anger I expected never came. What came instead was a cold, settled clarity, the exact feeling I used to get standing under a structure right before we tested its load limits. I knew, with total certainty, that this was the last dinner like this I would ever sit through. I set my napkin beside my plate. I stood without a sound. I looked at Denise, then at Preston, then finally at my daughter, and I said nothing at all. I turned and walked out through the private dining room's heavy door, and it closed behind me with a soft, final click, sealing them all inside with their little victory. I didn't call a car. I walked the 11 blocks home, through the part of downtown that still had streetlights instead of chandeliers, until the noise thinned out and my own neighborhood came into view. A modest brick house, under 2 old maple trees, that I had designed myself and helped frame with my own hands almost 3 decades ago. Inside, it smelled like cedar and old paper, like a life built for permanence instead of applause. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't pour myself a drink. I went straight into the small back room I use as a study, where the walls are covered in framed drawings of overpasses and retaining walls, real things, load-bearing things, and on the shelf sat a photograph of Whitney at 7 years old in a hard hat 2 sizes too big for her, grinning at me from the seat of a bulldozer, so proud she could barely hold still for the picture. Where did I lose that girl? The question didn't hit like a blade. It landed slow and heavy, like something I'd been carrying so long I'd stopped noticing the weight. I had spent years believing that quiet, unconditional love was enough on its own, and I had been wrong, because there is a difference between loving someone unconditionally and financing them unconditionally. Tonight, the financing was going to stop. I sat down at my desk and opened an old encrypted file on my computer, one I had built and maintained for over a decade, with a password only I had ever known. Inside were folders with names that meant nothing to anyone who didn't know what they represented. A holding company, a commercial property trust, a seed investment agreement, a vehicle lease structured through a third party. Each one was a beam hidden inside a wall, invisible from the outside, holding up everything my daughter believed she'd built alone. I opened a secure message to a woman named Bianca Farrow, an attorney I'd trusted with everything that mattered for 15 years, the only other person alive who understood the full shape of what I'd built. I wrote 4 words: begin the quiet audit. I hit send, and somewhere out there, the first domino tipped forward, resting right on the edge. The next morning, Bianca met me in her office on the 31st floor with 2 cups of black coffee already poured, because she knew exactly what those 4 words meant, and exactly how I take my coffee when I mean business. She sat beside me instead of across from me. She told me that when she read my message, some part of her had hoped this day would never come, that Whitney would eventually figure things out on her own, without anyone having to pull the floor out from under her. I told her I'd hoped the same thing for years, but the floor needed to come out now. She asked me to walk her through what had actually happened at dinner, the human part no legal document could capture. I told her everything: the suit comment, the concrete comment, the word embarrassed said out loud in a room full of strangers, while her mother looked at a tablecloth instead of at me. Bianca was quiet for a long moment, And then she reminded me of something I already knew better than anyone. None of what Whitney had was actually hers to begin with. 9 years ago, Whitney had come to me with an idea for an interior design studio, full of ambition and absolutely no capital, no clients, and no understanding of how business insurance worked. I knew if I simply wrote her a check for $140,000, she would burn through it within 18 months and learn nothing except that money appears when you ask for it. So I told her my savings were tied up in retirement accounts, boring and inaccessible. And Whitney, disappointed, told her mother I was playing it safe again and went looking elsewhere. She never had to look far. Bianca and I had already set up a private investment vehicle registered in Delaware, faceless and clean, with a semi-retired architect I trusted acting as its friendly public face. When Whitney found this mysterious boutique investment group willing to fund a young, promising designer, she believed she'd been discovered. She never once asked who actually controlled the fund behind the fund. The paperwork, if she'd read it closely, which she never did, showed that the holding entity retained 62% ownership of her firm. Whitney held the rest as founder and CEO, which meant she ran the company. It did not mean she owned it. Then there was the car, the pale blue coupe she loved showing off in photographs, the one she told interviewers she'd bought herself the year the firm turned a profit. Her personal credit hadn't actually been strong enough to lease something in that price range, so the lease had gone through a small fleet management company, one more shell tucked inside another shell, one more piece of scaffolding she never noticed. The contract was explicit. The lease existed only as long as she remained affiliated with the firm in good standing. And then, the largest piece of all, the penthouse. Bianca had always said this one felt different, more personal, and she was right, because it had everything to do with Denise. After Denise left me for Preston, she became obsessed with the idea that where you live announces who you are, and she'd spent years telling our daughter the same thing. When Whitney and Colton went hunting for the right address, something with views and a doorman and a certain zip code, they found a converted warehouse building downtown with exactly the kind of exposed brick and steel beams people photograph for magazines. Whitney asked me for help with the deposit. I told her it wasn't wise to stretch that far. What I didn't tell her was that I had purchased that entire building 4 years earlier through another entity, back when the neighborhood was still considered a risk. When Whitney applied for the top floor unit, the property management company, which answered to me, reached out with an irresistible offer, a reduced rent arrangement in exchange for having a rising young entrepreneur as the building's flagship tenant. Whitney signed the lease, feeling flattered, feeling chosen. She never read the clause near the bottom stating the reduced rate was contingent on continuous, good-standing employment at her own firm, terminable with 72 hours' notice. So there it was, laid bare on Bianca's desk. The firm, the car, the home. Every pillar of the identity my daughter had built for herself was a structure I had quietly engineered, funded, and still owned the deed to. She wasn't a self-made woman. She was a daughter who had never once been told the truth about her own foundation. Bianca asked what I wanted to do first, whether I wanted to hit everything at once, the accounts, the lease, the car, all before Monday's close of business. A full collapse. I shook my head. That's demolition without a plan, I told her. That's not correction. That's destruction. And this was never about destruction. I explained it the only way I knew how. When you need to bring an unstable structure down safely, you don't set explosives at random. And remove the ornamental pieces first, the things that catch the eye but hold no weight. Then you take the windows, the view of the world the person has built for themselves. Then, finally, you get down to the foundation, so what's left is only what was ever real. I didn't want to destroy my daughter. I wanted to force her to stand on the ground, instead of on a structure I had built underneath her without her knowledge. We built the timeline together. Monday, the car, the most visible symbol, gone by mid-morning. Tuesday, the firm's accounts frozen and Preston's consulting arrangement, which I'd only recently learned about, quietly severed in the same motion. Wednesday, the eviction notice on the penthouse, delivered by someone who had never met her and felt nothing about it either way. Over that weekend, while I repotted tomato plants on my back steps in the kind of quiet that used to scare me and now felt like oxygen, Whitney was somewhere across town celebrating. I pieced this together later from voicemails and one very long, very tearful phone call. She told her friends I was a relic who couldn't handle being outshined by his own daughter. She joked that I'd come around within a week, the way I always did. She mistook my patience for weakness, the way people who've never been tested always do. She and Colton went out for a celebratory dinner that weekend, on Preston's card, to toast finally setting boundaries with her difficult, old-fashioned father. Preston, for his part, told her she'd done the right thing, that men of my generation simply didn't understand ambition. He called himself her real mentor. A real mentor whose entire financial life, though none of them knew it yet, was propped up by a single consulting contract I had quietly funded for years without either of them realizing where the money actually originated. Monday came, and I spent the morning on my porch with black coffee and the newspaper, while, across town, gears I'd set in motion turned without me lifting another finger. Whitney walked out of her building toward her pale blue coupe in the parking garage, feeling, I imagine, like the version of herself she'd built for magazine profiles. There was a tow truck already parked behind the car, hazard lights blinking, a man in coveralls crouched by the rear wheel. She told him he had the wrong vehicle. He held up a work order with her license plate on it, issued by a leasing entity she had never heard of in her life. She called the leasing company, her voice climbing in pitch, and a calm woman on the other end confirmed that the lease had been terminated that morning by the vehicle's legal owner and that the matter was closed. She stood on the curb in her tailored blazer and watched her car get winched up the ramp of a flatbed, and then there was nothing left but an empty parking space and the smell of exhaust. If the car was a warning shot, Tuesday was the flood. Whitney arrived at her studio late, having paid for an overpriced rideshare across town, determined to project calm to her small staff. She tried to order her usual round of coffee from the shop downstairs for her team, and her card declined. She tried again. Declined again. Upstairs, in her glass-walled office with her name stenciled on the door in gold lettering, she opened the firm's financial portal and typed in her password. Access denied. She tried once more, carefully, and the same two words blinked back at her. An email arrived moments later informing her that majority ownership had suspended all operational access to accounts and credit pending a financial review. Majority ownership. She had always assumed her silent investors were exactly that, silent, content to collect a return and stay out of her way. She had never once wondered what would happen if they decided otherwise. Then her phone rang. It was Preston, and his voice wasn't warm or confident at all. It was thin and fast and frightened. His consulting payment, the one that funded the lake house, the leased convertible, the country club dues, hadn't landed, and it was never late. He was already imagining foreclosure notices. He demanded Whitney fix it, as though she had any idea what it even was. And somewhere in that panicked phone call, my daughter began to suspect, for the first time, that all of this might be connected. By Wednesday, Whitney came home hollow, having spent the entire day dodging vendors and enduring quiet, pitying looks from her own staff. The penthouse was the last thing standing, until it wasn't. Colton was already inside, pale, having just watched his own card get declined at the dry cleaner. There was a firm knock at the door. A woman in a charcoal suit introduced herself as the new property manager and stepped inside like she already owned the place, because in every way that mattered, I did. She handed Whitney a formal notice, 72 hours to vacate, the reduced rate arrangement void due to the tenant's change in employment status. Whitney protested that there had to be some mistake, that she had a special deal. The woman only pointed to the clause near the bottom of the lease, the one Whitney had never read, and said there was no mistake at all. That was when Colton broke, first with a short, disbelieving laugh, then with real panic, asking where they were supposed to go, turning on Whitney and accusing her of dragging them into this with her pride, her stubborn refusal to just apologize to her father. And in the silence after his outburst, Whitney looked down at the small print on the eviction notice and saw, for the third time that week, the name of an entity she didn't recognize, a car repossessed by one company, a firm frozen by anonymous majority owners, a home taken by another. It wasn't bad luck stacking up. It was coordinated, deliberate, and personal. There was only one person, quiet enough, patient enough, and precise enough to have built something like this without her ever noticing. The man she'd called an embarrassment 3 days earlier. Her hands were shaking when she called me. I answered on the second ring, my voice even and unhurried, and I think that calm frightened her more than anger would have. She said I had done this, all of it, the car, the firm, the apartment, And it wasn't a question, it was an accusation thrown like a stone. On my end, there was a long silence, the same silence I'd been sitting in since that dinner. But this silence wasn't defeat. It was the stillness of someone who is, for the first time in years, standing on solid ground. I told her it was time we talked, and to come to the house. She arrived less than 30 minutes later in a rattling rideshare, nothing like the car she'd lost 4 days earlier. I waited in my study, the same room where all of this had started, and let the doorbell ring twice before telling her to come in. She stormed through the door, not with the confidence of a woman who ran a design firm, but with the unraveling panic of someone whose whole floor had disappeared beneath her feet. She looked around that small room, at the drawings of bridges on the walls, and for the first time in her adult life, I think she actually saw it. Instead of just dismissing it as her father's boring hobby space. I didn't stand. I gestured to the chair across from my desk and told her to sit, that we weren't going to yell, that it was time to listen instead. Something in my voice made her sit without arguing. I turned my monitor to face her, and one by one, I showed her everything. The incorporation documents with the holding company's true ownership, the lease agreement for the car, signed by an entity she'd never heard of until that Monday morning. The deed to the entire building she'd been living in, my name listed as the owner of record for 4 years. I told her, gently, because gentleness lands harder than anger ever could, that she had never owned any of it. That she had been living, rent-reduced and unaware, inside a life I had built and was now quietly dismantling because the version of her that had emerged inside it was someone I no longer recognized. Her face went pale as she stared at page after page of proof. And then I opened the last folder. I told her there was one more piece, the keystone, and I asked if she'd ever wondered why Preston's only real client seemed to be her own company, why a man who talked endlessly about ambition and empire building had never once mentioned a second deal, a second contract, a second source of income. I showed her the consulting agreement. $42,000 a month, paid from her firm's accounts, funded entirely by the same holding company that controlled her ownership stake. Every dollar Preston had ever spent boasting about his success had passed through my hands first. Whitney made a small, choked sound and sat back hard in the chair. The man her mother had left me for, the man who lectured her about builders and empires from the comfort of a life he never actually built, had been living off money that originated, every single time, with me. That was the moment the whole structure inside her finally gave way, quietly, the way a building does when the load-bearing wall is finally removed and there's nothing left holding up the floors above it. I closed the laptop. I told her I hadn't taken anything that was ever truly hers. I had simply stopped lending her a life she'd mistaken for her own. And then, for the first time since she was a teenager, I told her she had an actual chance in front of her. To get a job, any job, to pay for an apartment she could genuinely afford, to learn what it felt like to build one true thing with her own hands, instead of standing on scaffolding she couldn't see. The trust still existed, her name was still on it, but she wouldn't see another dollar from it until she'd built something without me standing invisibly behind it. Then I stood, and I walked out of my own study and left my daughter alone with the truth for the first time in her life. The days after that were the quietest I'd known in years. No manufactured emergencies. No manipulative calls disguised as concern. Just peace, plain and unremarkable, the kind you don't appreciate until you've lived without it for a long time. I sat on my porch one evening with a glass of iced tea, and I realized something I should have understood a decade earlier. I had never been the embarrassment. I had been the quiet foundation holding up people who never once thanked the ground beneath their feet, and now, finally, I was free of the weight of it. My phone rang. It was Denise. I almost didn't answer, but some old, tired curiosity made me pick up and stay silent, just listening. Her voice came through fast and unfiltered, full of panic that had nothing to do with our daughter and everything to do with herself. Preston's contract was gone. The lake house payment had bounced. Their country club membership was under review. And somehow, in her telling, all of it was my fault, born from jealousy, from bitterness, from an old man who couldn't stand watching other people succeed. There was no mention of the dinner, no mention of our daughter. Just a demand, plain and entitled, that I fix what I had broken, because I still had the money, and in her mind, I still owed her for a marriage she'd ended. I let her finish. I let the silence stretch out long enough to feel uncomfortable on her end, And when I finally spoke, there was no anger in my voice at all, only a simple, settled fact. "Denise," I said, "that's not my problem anymore." I ended the call, set the phone face down on the porch railing, and let the slow creak of my chair fill the silence again. I had gotten my dignity back. I had gotten my peace back. And in the quiet of that evening, for the first time in longer than I could remember, the man my own daughter had called an embarrassment finally felt, without needing anyone else to confirm it, like the only one at that table who had actually built something that would last. So let me ask you this, because I really do want to know. Do you think I did the right thing? Tell me one if you think I was completely justified, that this was the hardest kind of love there is. Tell me two if you think I went too far, that I should have found a gentler way to bring her back down to earth. Or tell me three if you think the real blame belongs to her mother and Preston, and my daughter was only ever the finished product of what they built in her. And tell me where you're watching this from, and what time it is right where you are, because it still amazes me how far a quiet story like mine can travel. Has someone in your life ever underestimated exactly what you were capable of? Tell me about it below. I read every single comment, every one of them. If this story meant something to you, do me a favor and stick around, because I've got more stories like this one, about quiet people who get written off, and about the exact moment the truth finally catches up to everyone who doubted them. Thank you for staying with me until the end. Thank you for caring enough to listen. Real love isn't measured by how much you hand someone, but by how much you let them stand on their own 2 feet. Sometimes the kindest thing a parent can do is step back and let the fall teach what words never could. Quiet patience isn't weakness, it's just love waiting for the right moment to become wisdom. And it's never too late to build something true again, together. A small note for you. This story was written and fictionalized by AI purely for entertainment, though we hope the life lesson tucked inside it stays with you in a genuine way.